Okay. So to start today, like I said, everyone should have pages 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That's what I handed out. And then your maps, especially maps 3, 4, and 5. We're going to reference those again tonight. So just have those out maybe in a loose sheet next year. Oh, you don't? Okay. Anyone else need maps? Those ones there. Oh, and then 5 on the other side.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You have a copy? If you want. I printed off several of these people that lost them. Okay. So to recap from last class, a little bit of a review to get our brains in the subject again. Talk about Zionism. That was really the topic of the study. We talked about the origin of the name Zion. You can comment on that, or just some of the basic tenets or results of Zionism, the movement, the school of thought. Or any outstanding questions about Zionism. You know, we covered a lot of nuanced issues, and if you have anything glaring, please let me know. So what does Zion refer to? Good. First of all, the hill in Jerusalem, then by extension, all of Jerusalem, and kind of by even broader extension, the land of Israel. So Zionism was a movement mainly among Jews to do what? Related to the land of Israel. Okay, good. That'd be a good way to put it. Yeah, for Jews, who had been spread out, you know, into all these different countries, Zionism was this return to come back to the land of Israel and claim it as a land for Jews to live in. That's the basic tenet of Zionism. Okay, so that was the basic idea. Anything else that stuck out to anyone about Zionism? Kind of getting at one of the punchlines of this Bible study is that there are Christian Zionists. There are Christians who think that there's a real religious necessity for the Jews to have this land in Israel. And that informs sometimes why you'll hear Christians talk about Israel as they do. We talked about a couple very interesting, fascinating people. Theodore Herzl, you'll hear his name connected to Zionism. He was kind of the architect of modern Israel, even though he didn't live to see its founding. He wrote a book around 1900 that laid out his plan for a Jewish state. And then, so he was kind of the political junkie. And then we had the bookworm of the movement, Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. Do you remember what he did? He was a linguist who did what? Good, right. So we talked about how wild this is, that he took this ancient language and started speaking it to his son as a native language. And his son was the first person to speak biblical Hebrew as a mother tongue. And now it's the only official language in Israel, you know, but they've basically resurrected this old language and speak it as their own. So that was also crucial to the formation of this state because, again, you had all these Jews coming from different places, spoke different languages. This was a unifying force for them. Okay, anything else before we move on? Okay, on to page 15. I'm kind of have a different format of handout. Maybe don't assault you with so much text. I just have kind of an outline that I'll explain as we go along. If you have questions, let me know. So again, kind of rich in history tonight again, but we'll make our biblical applications at the end. The modern state of Israel, 1948 to the present. Once you understand Zionism, that movement, the place to go for the origin of the modern state of Israel is the end of World War I. Why the end of World War I? Because the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918, and the Ottoman Empire from 1517 to 1917 ruled Israel. So for 400 years, that was a long time compared to other powers who had ruled there. And with the coming of the Ottoman Empire in general, that's when the population of Jews in Israel starts to increase. Remember that little V I had last time? The population decreased from the time of Christ until 1517, until it was only 5. I saw another estimate of a few years later, 2,000 Jews in the whole land of Israel. And then it starts to increase under the Ottomans. At the end of World War I, the League of Nations was created. This was an interesting group of nations brought together to avoid another world war. It was kind of formulated by Woodrow Wilson, but ironically enough, people say the League of Nations didn't really work that effectively because America didn't join it. So our president was the one who came up with the idea, but America would not join the League of Nations. After World War II, the League of Nations becomes the United Nations. So this League of Nations is formed, and they have what's called a mandate. A mandate is, here's the definition, a status of various territories which had been held by Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, transferring them to Allied powers until they could manage their own independence. When I was in middle school, one of the reasons we learned that World War I came to be was because of imperialism. You have all these European countries going out and getting colonies and all these hinterlands places, Africa, Asia, Americas, and they're all jockeying for these colonies, and that was part of what created the tension among them that led to World War I. When Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire lose, the Allied powers by and large strip them of their colonies and take control of them until they can become independent nations, and that was called a mandate. Palestine, of course, was under Ottoman control, and the mandate for Palestine transferred control of Palestine and territory east of the Jordan River from the Ottoman Empire to the British Empire. So now we get British rule in Palestine, and it's called the British Mandate for Palestine. So that officially begins 1922. But in 1917, before the end of World War I, there's what's called I actually haven't ever even heard this pronounced, but the Balfour Declaration, which is an amazingly important letter written by a British official to the head of a powerful Jewish organization in Britain, basically detailing what's the intention of the British government toward this land if and when they take control of it, which happened. And here's what the Balfour Declaration says. First of all, it declared British support for establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This was intentionally vague. A national home, what does that mean? In there was the possibility of an actual state that the Jews would be able to rule over. But notice it says establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, which was interpreted to mean the Jews can settle in Palestine and have their own place, but it's not going to be all of Palestine that they get. So that was the intention of the British when they took control. But it also stated, point 2, that it was clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And that's a sticking point to this day. The Arab Palestinians who have been living there now for several hundred years are in some cases getting pushed around or pushed out by the Jews who want to settle this land. And that was not the intention of the British, at least. So take a look at the population in Palestine from 1800 to 1947. it lays out the population of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in this territory. And while the populations of all of them increase, the proportion of Jews to Muslims increases. At first, it's 7 to 246. But by 1947, it's half, 50% of the amount of Palestinians there are Jews.
No, that's not necessarily births, right? That could be immigration as well.
Exactly. Yeah, just the people living there. Yep. Okay, so let's go to page 16 and talk about how we got there. So as Jeremy kind of alluded to, point C, there's continuous Jewish settlement in Israel, increasing in the 1900s, and there are on and off clashes between Jews and Palestinian Arabs. So even before Israel becomes a state, while the British are ruling, the Jews and Arabs are not coexisting peacefully. But what we talked about in the last class, Zionism produces this impulse for a lot of Jews to come back to Israel, persecution in various places. And what was the chief act of persecution that drove a lot of Jews back to Israel? World War II and the Holocaust, right? So after, after 1945, there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who come to settle in Israel. If you look back on the previous chart from 1931, which is just before Hitler takes power in Germany, to 1947, the population of Jews, more than triples. So that shows that period especially was a very intense one for Jewish settlement in Israel. Now remember, the plan of the League of Nations was not that the British would rule Palestine forever as a colony. It was the British are going to take care of this until somehow we can have independent states existing here. So there was always the plan that in the next couple decades, the British should get out. And in the late 1940s, that's what happened. So toward the end of the British mandate, the end of, you could say, Britain's responsibility to take care of this land, there was a plan drawn up, approved by the UN, the League of Nations, again turned into the UN, for independent Arab and Jewish states in Palestine. And see that map on page 16. This was the proposal of which land would be set aside for a Jewish state and which land for an Arab state. Now, these issues in the 1940s are still the issues talked about today. You've probably heard the term a two-state solution, right? If you keep up on Israeli-Arab relations. That means somehow we're going to divide this land. But of course, the discussion is always difficult because which land do we give to each side? And then in this plan too, Jerusalem was going to be its own district under UN control. When we first defined Zionism, I said that Jerusalem, it's kind of maybe going out on a limb, but Jerusalem is just as important as the rest of the land. They could have the whole land, but if they don't have Jerusalem, most Jews don't think that they have what they should have. So that's key. So here's where the turn of events gets really bizarre and kind of exciting. Point E, December of 1947, Britain announces control of Palestine will end May 15th, 1948. They had this plan set up, but to be honest, there wasn't a lot of follow-through planned. Plans to make this actually become a reality. There was no transitional period. They only leave themselves with 5 months until they're going to just pull out their government. And a lot of people say the British, after fighting World War II and now having to rule Palestine, kind of like the, schoolyard supervisor pulling the Jews and Arabs apart again and again, they were just exhausted and ready to be done. They'd sent troops there and military personnel for so many years that they said, let's just get this over with. So May 15th, 1948, they're pulling out. May 14th, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, one of its founders, a leading Zionist, declares the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine beginning at midnight, May 15th, 1948, when British control will end. So you could say there was this group, right, that was very committed to a Jewish state in Israel, and they saw this opportunity, and they grabbed hold of it, and that was about as much planning as seemed to have been done at that point. But it actually worked out. So let's talk about how the state actually came to be. So technically, these Jews, the Zionists, have kind of a government and have declared that this state is theirs, this territory. But immediately, war breaks out. So going on to point 3, or Roman numeral 3.a, on page 17, a civil war in Palestine had been simmering after the UN released its plan for the division of Palestine between Jews and Arabs. On May 15, 1948, it erupted into a regional war. So here's what happens. You know, it's like the British ships are tooting their horns as they're leaving in the Mediterranean, and the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, and some Iraqi troops are sort of seeing them go, and they say the Jews want to stay in Israel over our dead bodies, and they send tanks in. I mean, it's just so weird how, you know, it's like these official moves, and yet all these people are trying to make their move at the same time. So these 4 countries invaded Israel, and really their first goal, which was not totally unjustifiable, was to claim those orange areas on the map on page 16, to go and occupy those areas and make sure that those territories would be actually held for Arabs. Okay, as far as a political move, that's maybe not the worst thing in the world, but here's where the sticking point comes in. They secured the areas where Arabs were living and then started attacking Israeli forces and settlements. Down to that point 3. Going back to this war, as we interpret the history, Israel claims we were just claiming the territory that was given to us by the UN. It was the Arabs who started a violent war that we then had to, fight to defend ourselves. Does that make sense? The arguments being made here. So war goes on for 10 months into 1949, and here's where things lie after the war. So the aftermath of the 1948 war, Israel held control of its areas in the UN plan, all those green shaded areas on page 16, as well as 60% of territory set aside for Palestinian Arabs. So at the end of the war, they end up taking some of that orange territory, mainly that little block of territory in the far north where it says Galilee on page 16. And then they cut down what's called the West Bank, which is this little lump around Jerusalem. That's called the West Bank because it's on that west bank of the Jordan River. And they are able to reach Jerusalem. So they take some of that territory, and that's the 60% that they claimed. Okay, any questions? So here's where we really get a huge demographic shift. After the war, about 700,000 Palestinian Arabs left Israel. Remember in 1947 there were 100,000? A little over 1 million Palestinians. So the majority of them leave. They're either forced to leave by the Israelis or conditions are so bad that they leave. About 700,000 Jews moved in. So now you get a shift in the majority population of Jews to Palestinians. But the Arab control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip remains. Go to map 4. Our other map sheet, map 4. So you see where it's labeled Gaza and then West Bank. So this is Israel's boundaries today, but I just want to illustrate that those territories were still controlled by the Arab Palestinians, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Yes.
So when this war happened, these countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, are primarily Muslim.
Correct.
Now,
Yes.
when this war happens, what do the Palestinian Christians do? Are they kind of caught in the middle? They kind of hunker down and wait and see what happens?
I'm not sure about this war, what side they sort of took or what their position was. But to this day, in general, Palestinian Arab Christians do identify with this pan-Arab side of things. So I would think that these Arab Christians would have been in the camp of, we've been living here for hundreds of years, our land is being taken from us. And probably, even though the other countries are Muslim, I would assume would have supported their efforts to keep their land for them. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that. Yeah. So Israel has control of much of the country, but Arab control remains in certain areas. Gaza, for example, was ruled by Egypt, so that was an Egypt kind of protectorate. And then the West Bank, there was work from Jordan that they did to govern the West Bank under their own power. So Arab control exists in the West Bank and Gaza Strip until we get to point C, which is the 6-Day War. And I don't even know if I noted it here. The 6-Day War happens in 1967. Maybe add that in if you can. 1967 is the 6-Day War. 20 years later, this war breaks out, and it shows you just how unstable things are left in 1948. There's no resolution in the hearts of Israelis and Palestinians. So the 6-Day War actually starts from kind of an innocuous issue. It's caused by a shipping route closure to Israeli vessels by Egypt in the Straits of Tiran, which is the little red dot down there. So are you kind of orienting yourselves? That's the Sinai Peninsula. Straight up from that red dot is Israel, and then up to the left is the Mediterranean Sea. So Israel can obviously ship things out of the Mediterranean, but those straits are pretty crucial for southern Israel receiving or shipping out anything. And Israel told Egypt, if you close this route to us, there will be war, and they did. So there's a little bit of debate in all these conflicts of who actually started it, but that was the basic premise. 1967. Turn the page 18. Israeli victory in this war. I handed this out early on in our study, but go to map 3. Just a little bit of the background. Again, Israel said that Egypt, if they closed these straits, it would be a cause for war, that they would wage war against them. And then there are claims that Egypt took made some belligerent acts against Israel to actually spark the war. But the bottom line was the Israelis kind of had the upper hand, and they destroyed the Egyptian airfields that were going to supply the war into Israel. So Israel had total air power supremacy. The Egyptians' planes and airfields were totally destroyed, basically. So as you can see, the war doesn't last very long. The Israeli military plunges not only into the Sinai Peninsula, but into these hotly contested territories, Gaza, the West Bank, and then up north in the Golan Heights, and they take all of them. So at the end of the war, we have kind of the basis for the modern borders, as you can see comparing map 3 to map 4, as well as points of conflict. What do I mean by that? The Golan Heights are effectively annexed into Israel, and those aren't too hotly contested. But Gaza is still claimed by Israel as part of its territory, and the West Bank as well. And that's why you'll see dotted lines on the maps. even to this day, because it's contested who actually owns and controls this territory. So they militarily take control of these areas, but there's so much pressure from the international community that going all the way back to the British, this was never the plan that Israel could just take over this whole territory and govern it. But there are a lot of Israelis who, again, based on very strong religious convictions, believe this land is ours, effectively. So if we militarily gained it, it should be up to us to rule and control and do what we want with. Now, as you can see from the Israel's boundaries today map 4, there's still a lot of Palestinians there, and there are still pockets where Palestinians control what goes on. And yet the Israelis are kind of hovering over them, saying this territory is ours. It's a strange situation. But the 1967 war is the most important to understand where we are today. There have been others along the way, but this is the most major one that designates the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as problem areas for conflict between these groups. Especially after this war, there is a policy of Israeli settlement into these territories. So Israeli settlement is basically Israeli citizens being moved by their government, having their living heavily subsidized in these territories, just so the Israeli government can have some of its own citizens on the ground living there to kind of claim the land for Israel. These have been widely condemned by the international community because they're not settled territories. It's all a really complex issue. There were Israelis who were settled in Gaza. In 2005, those were all pulled out. There were also actually some Israelis who settled in Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, which was gained actually as territory in the 1967 Six-Day War, but those were moved out in 1979. But so that's kind of been a modus operandi of Israelis, that we take these places militarily, then we settle our people there and try to make a claim for the land. Now, people can debate whether that's legitimate or not, but that's been kind of the approach. So, and then the last point to note, you can see that Jerusalem is right on the border between the West Bank and Israel proper. You can look at either of those maps, map 3 or map 4. Jerusalem is right on the border. So Jerusalem is supposed to be a divided city. West Jerusalem is technically under Israeli control, and East Jerusalem, international or Palestinian control. So I'm sure many of you remember when Germany was a divided country and Berlin was split in half. That's kind of the situation here. You have these two factions in this one land. You have these borders dividing these areas, except in Germany there wasn't one half trying to control the other, but that's how you should think about Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, again, is a huge issue, and there are estimated 300,000 Israelis living in East Jerusalem, which is not supposed to be part of Israel proper. They've settled 300,000 people there. I just looked up some of these stats. In the Golan Heights, which they took in the 1967 war, there are about 20,000 Israeli settlers. In the West Bank, there are 380,000 Israelis. So those are Israelis who have, since 1948, basically been settled in those areas and have created communities. And then, like I said, Gaza, they pulled out settlements from there. And this is really getting into the weeds of debates about Israel today. But here's another key issue. The West Bank is claimed by Israel through military control, right? They went in and conquered it with their military. They rule over these Palestinians basically militarily. it is actually considered a war crime to settle citizens of a country in an occupied territory. That's what some people have said that Israel is doing. And there's kind of a double standard in the West Bank. The Israeli military rules over the territory as an occupied area, but the Israelis who live there are treated under the same laws that they would be if they lived actually in Israel. Might seem like a minor point, but in international law, that's actually a big deal. That these Israelis are settled in this area hasn't been officially brought into the nation of Israel. It's ruled by the military, and yet they are treated as if they're living in the country itself. So a lot of tangled issues. Thoughts or questions on those wars? Is it kind of, yeah. Does some of it make sense though of how it's kind of operating now? And the messiness comes from you had these Palestinians living there. So when Israelis declare that they have control of these areas, the West Bank primarily, what do? Who's their government and what laws are they subject to? Now, internationally, there actually is a state of Palestine. And I started to do some digging into this, and it's hard to sleuth through. But turn your page over to map 5. This just zeroes in on the West Bank and on Gaza. Basically, think of the Palestinians as kind of operating this government under the kind of tacit approval of the Israeli military. That's kind of how to think about it. They don't live in Israel, but the Israeli military ultimately kind of has control over them. But there are Palestinians who are ruling these territories and having some kind of government. Between the Palestinians, there are two groups on this map, the blue group and the pink group. Right? The blue group is this Fatah faction, which is ruling in the West Bank, and the pink group is Hamas, ruling in Gaza. And yeah, because there are so many Palestinians there, for the Israelis to actually govern day to day would be so violent and so difficult for them that it's as if the Israelis kind of let the Palestinians do their own thing under their purview. So there are these two factions among the Palestinians who are kind of go back and forth. You can kind of think of them as political parties, but Hamas among some people is regarded as a terrorist organization. But they do rule this area of Palestine, Gaza. They have on the ground control of it. And that's about all the clarity I can give to that. But
so if somebody does something wrong, then the other one bombs them, and then they turn around and bomb the other one.
well, and I think, yeah, that's often how it happens. And on a human level, you can kind of think of the Palestinians as people who see themselves as occupied by a foreign power, and that foreign power is oppressing, kind of harassing them or restricting their rights to free economy, freedom of movement, freedom of employment. Many Palestinian Arabs live in severe poverty and don't have great services. There's going to be a lot of tension there, yeah. And at the same time, this kind of overarching power, the Israelis, feel like if we let the Palestinians criticize us too much or take too much action to do their own thing freely, we're going to totally lose control of the area. So, yeah, there's reasons for aggression on both sides, yeah. So I'm no expert in the political science of it. But remember that all of this effort and expense by the Israelis is ultimately grounded in their belief that God gave them this land and this is their place that they're supposed to be. Okay, well, as that all percolates, this will actually be a little bit lighter to talk about. Let's just talk about the nation of Israel as a modern state, what it's like So go back to page 18 in the handout. With all of these immigrants coming from, a lot of them from European countries, Israel was modeled after a European democracy. So they are not imitating the Old Testament in many ways, right? The Old Testament Israel was ruled by kings or by, God directly, and that's not what they're doing. They're creating a modern nation state. And in Israel, there is freedom of religion, technically. There are Palestinians who live even within the confines of Israel proper, and they're allowed to practice their religion. So are Christians. But Israel was founded as a Jewish state. And let's talk about what that means. First of all, they have what's called the law of return. And naturally, it gives Jews greater potential for growth in population. So it means that if you practice the Jewish religion, or you can trace your ancestry back to Jews, part of the people of Israel, Jacob and his 12 sons, no matter where you live, you can come to Israel and get citizenship. So that's their policy. I know I corrected this in a last class. You can be a Christian or a Muslim and have Israeli citizenship. If you're within the borders that Israel controls, not just Gaza or the West Bank, but in Israel itself, you can be an Israeli citizen, but you're a small minority, and Christians and Muslims can't just move to Israel and claim citizenship. So Jews are given that preference. So let's look at the numbers under point 2. 1, in 1947, 60% of the population was Palestinian Arabs, 32% Jews. In 2021, it's 20% Palestinian Arabs, 75% Jews, and that's in a population of a little over 9 million citizens. So it is kind of living up to that goal of being a Jewish state. Israel is known as a militarized society. You can see kind of why, because their nation was founded out of and formed through wars. But they have mandatory military service for Israelis over 18. Men have to serve 3 years and women 2. And the only exemptions are if you're an Orthodox Jew, an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and want to exempt yourself on religious grounds, or if you're an Arab living in Israel. You don't have to serve in the military. But, of course, probably a lot of Arabs exempt themselves, because what wars are you going to be fighting in the Israeli military? It's going to be wars essentially against your own people. So they do give them the exemption. And let's talk about religion in Israel. Jews are obviously the dominant religious group, but here we have to parse out again that Jew can refer either to someone with the ethnic background, like you might be German or English or Irish. You can be Jewish ethnically, and or you can be a practitioner of the Jewish religion, Judaism. So there are ethnic Jews who can be atheist, right? Ethnically they're Jewish, religiously not, and still fall under the category of Jew because of their ancestry. And then also Israel has come down on Messianic Jews, which is a mixture of Judaism and Protestant Christianity. You take aspects of the Old Testament but believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, but they're not considered Jews according to the state of Israel. Does that make sense? That idea of a Jewish state isn't just religious. It's also about the ethnicity. Yes?
Pastor, this is for everybody. Does everyone understand that when Pastor says Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jew, that is not the Judaism of the Old Testament? It is different than, it's more like the Pharisees, actually.
Good. And Judaism has, right, in all of its iterations, is distinct from Old Testament religion because it's been so modified by the traditions of the rabbis that it contains, well, obviously they very much downplay the messianic promise that runs through the Old Testament, and they lift up instead the law and what God expects of us to do. So good point, though, Jeremy. So we have Jews who make up about 80% of the population, or 75% at least. Then we have Palestinian Arabs. Now that's an ethnic designation. They come from that region of the world, the Arabian Peninsula. Those people spread out. Palestinian Arabs. They're divided into two religious groups. Arab Muslims, which are 90% of the Arabs in Israel and about 17% of the population. And then Arab Christians, about 10% of Arabs in Israel and about 2% of the Israeli population. The Christians who are there are mainly either Greek Catholic or Greek Orthodox. So Orthodox is like Eastern Orthodox. Greek Catholic is kind of an Eastern church, but they're in fellowship with the Pope. So they're essentially Roman Catholic, but with a different tradition. Interestingly, Arab Christians have a high level of education in comparison to other Israeli citizens. So like Arab Christians will be overrepresented in medical school beyond what their actual percentages in the population. They tend to show up in these high levels of education more often. And they have a higher income on average and social standing than Arab Muslims. So that's where Arab Christians kind of do fall in an in-between place. Ethnically, they're connected to this big Muslim population, but in their education, their economic standing, their social treatment, it tends to be like they're a little more like Jewish Israelis. So again, they kind of fall in between. Questions or thoughts on that? Just kind of the state of the Israeli nation today. There you have a little diagram. Sorry, it's a little bit rough, but Israel's political system to help you understand. If you're hearing about these people in the news, you can kind of place them. So the people elect their parliament, their representatives. Those people elect a prime minister. We had talked about the different parties and how they do that. The president in Israel, this is a good thing for us to realize in America, the president in these parliamentary democracies is kind of a figurehead. He doesn't really have a lot of power. It's the prime minister who calls the shots and really holds the power. Okay, other thoughts before we get to our kind of conclusion. So we're stretching through the whole study, and I'm just picking out the points I want you to take away and things that we can discuss. That would be some good food for thought and discussion. So first of all, God promised a people, a land, and a blessing for all nations to the descendants of Jacob and his 12 sons. Those promises were fulfilled in the Old Testament and with the coming of Christ. So God said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you will become a great nation. You'll have a people that will come from you. I will give you this land of Canaan, and you will be, all nations of the world will be blessed through you. The first two come true in the Old Testament. The third is fulfilled in Christ. 2, Christians do not need to support the modern state of Israel for spiritual reasons. As responsible citizens, they might or might not support Israel. But the claims some Christians make that we need to support Israel to carry out God's will are based on incorrect understandings of the Bible. Like I said, either believing that those promises in the Old Testament haven't been fulfilled, or that somehow this state of Israel is going to bring the second coming sooner or facilitate it happening. And those are not grounded in good biblical interpretation. Point 3, just a clarifying point. When we hear Palestinian, it doesn't necessarily mean Muslim. Palestinians are mostly Muslim. What about 10% of them are fellow Christians to us? And bringing all of these lessons together into a spiritually important point for us. We Christians should set our hopes and efforts on making it to heaven, the homeland of God's people, open to us through the life and death of Christ our Savior. not gaining some special nation on earth for ourselves, in the nation of Israel. Christians make up the true spiritual Israel. The church is our Zion, our city of God, where the Lord speaks, forgives, instructs, and saves. Paul writes, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" Right? We Christians don't have to work toward a new temple in Jerusalem. We are the temple of God. Hebrews says to the Christians, "You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in a festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant." That's the difference between us and the Jews. In Israel, they seek the end of a promise. We have Jesus, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Questions?
Well, you definitely put a lot of research into this. A lot of time.
Yeah, I hope it clarified some things instead of just making it more complex. That was my effort.
So basically, those that are fighting over there and what have you for that land and what have you, they're still living in the Old Testament times, trying to, this is where the Jews have to be,
Yeah.
because that's the promise they were given
Mhm.
in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And they just don't want to give that up.
Right, because for them, Christ hasn't fulfilled the Old Testament.
Correct.
So those promises still need to be.
The true Jew does not believe in Christ.
Yeah.
The Christian Jew does.
And the reason why I delved into more of the political background of Zionism and so on is to realize, at the same time, not all the Jews in Israel are motivated by purely religious motivations. A lot of them are, probably most of them. But like I said, you can have an atheist Jew who just thinks the last 200 years my people have been persecuted, so we just need our own land. And that might be their motivation. But all of it comes to the same goal. Yeah. So right, my last point is we are not Old Testament believers. We are New Testament believers. Yeah. Other reflections, things you learned, things that surprised you. Any shift in your own thinking, if you'd be willing to share.
So why does the United States think they have to help out a Jewish nation?
So at this point, I'm not speaking as pastor, but just what I think is at work. I think that the United States traditionally has seen Israel as a strong democracy in the Middle East and wants to support it to foster greater democracy there. That's probably what's happening. But as years have gone on, like I said, a lot of these American Christians with their misled beliefs about Israel, I think has furthered that. Yeah.
The wars never end in that area. We've been fighting, United States has been fighting over there in the wars and the sand hills and what have you, for what? It doesn't help anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I just don't see why we are so concerned with that area of the world.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of that go beyond my understanding.
I mean, that war has been going on, like you said, forever.
And at the same time, going back to biblical days, I mean, I can't peer into the mind of God, but why was it that this place was both the cradle of civilization and the place God chose to put his people? I think at that time it was kind of the center of the world. It was a central trade route. It had good land. It had shipping, capabilities. So, and of course now, what does it have that no one until 200 years ago cared about? Oil, of course. Yeah, yeah. So again, the political and the religious get mixed together. And that's, I think, my main point is to understand what is the religious component? Is it right? And as I've said, the support for Israel isn't really right in a religious sense. But let me kind of divorce that from my thinking so I, as a responsible citizen, can look at the actual political, civic issues and say, should I support this or that side? And you have the freedom to do that. Yeah. Yeah, Jeremy.
Well, I was just going to say one of the things about, and we brought this out again, is that we realize that there are brothers, they may not be Lutherans, but there are sisters in Christ over there who are caught in the middle of this.
Right.
And they should be kept in our thoughts and prayers because,
Yeah.
They didn't ask to be put in the middle of this, and they're stuck between a militant Israel on one side and a militant Muslim army on the other. And neither one of them are really wanted by either side.
Yeah. And also a good example for us too. We in our country probably, especially you who are older, have this perception that America is a country mostly of Christians. Someone in my generation doesn't take that for granted. As I see a lot of people from Christian backgrounds totally throwing that off. And to maybe look at those Arab Christians, and whichever side you would personally take politically, to say, look at how they are being, God's people in the middle of seemingly impossible circumstances, how they still are trying to be salt and light in the world by, educating their people, staying true to their faith, even when it would probably be politically advantageous to either go in one of the other directions. And to really, pray for them and pray that we would imbibe some of their commitment to the gospel. Yeah.
Pointed out too on page 18 about it being a freedom of religion, but we have family friends over there who are trying to spread the gospel, but they can't just come out and say, hey, we're spreading the gospel. It has to be done almost in a shady backdoor sort of way because they would be persecuted or even arrested if they knew that's what they were doing.
You can practice Christianity in Israel, but you cannot proselytize over it. Which, So if you were to try to go on the street and hand out Bibles or hand out tracts, you could get in hot water for that.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to know too how they treat the established churches there. Can the Greek Orthodox, do they have a little more leeway than like a Protestant coming in from America and trying to spread the gospel? Maybe, but that's often the case. Like in India, it's the same way with a Hindu majority. The Christians are generally left alone, but you can't proselytize. You can't try and go and evangelize, and over there, you can't have Americans preaching. Like our Lutheran professors can go and teach at their seminary, but they can't go on the street or even necessarily, go in the churches and preach. So it has to be for educational purposes or not. So in Israel, there's definitely a preference for Judaism. There are a lot of extra rights and privileges. Freedom of religion, but not in the way we think of it, definitely. Yeah.
It's funny to me said that about India because I have a physical therapist that I went to. He has a very English name, but he's very Indian, But his mom is still there, and she goes to an Assemblies of God church in India. And he is Catholic, I believe, here. So when we were doing therapy one day, he was just talking to me about, he's like, you should see my mom's church. And he was like telling me about the kinds of songs they've got drums and all this stuff. And it was funny to hear him because he wasn't used to that here, but he's like, you can't, like you said, you can't go out and just invite everybody the same way, but the way that certain denominations are trying to just make it attractive to the people is interesting, but it's still a different form of freedom of religion than we think of all the way around.
Yeah, and those Christians there in Israel, they might kind of identify with the other Arab Palestinians, but in places like Egypt, the Christians are under the same kind of oppression from the Muslim government. So it's just like wherever, and they might be ethnically the same, but their religion means that they're sort of second-class citizens. Yeah. Other thoughts? Maybe we should all come back at 11:30 when you've all been lying in bed and just come up with a question.
I'll email you.
Yeah. But again, to bring some light to the current situation and help you be both faithful Christians and responsible citizens has been the goal here.
Pastor,
Yes.
Jerry brought something up. No, that's a good idea. Would you be interested in doing something like this on Islam? Like a few weeks? Not necessarily right away, but I mean eventually. Because he was asking where did the Muslims come from? And
Yeah.
Abraham, did he have a concubine?
Yeah.
Muslim child?
Yep.
well, he wasn't Muslim.
Yeah. He's the founder of the Arab peoples, kind of.
Yeah.
So the ethnic peoples. Right. That would be a good other study.
Wow. Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah.
Just some food for thought.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just think if I had anything else. I don't think so. No one else has any comments or questions? We should be good to go. Like I said, if you think of something, write it down, save it for next week, or let me know during the week, and we'll address it at next week's class. That'll be the last class of this class, this sort of course. And we might have a couple weeks off until the beginning of August, but then I'd like to do a 3 or 4 week study before the school year starts up again at the same time. And then, like I said, next week, look forward to having all look up some things, and Herb and Ruth can give us a good overview of their time in Israel, and give you some options if you'd like to go. Okay, well, let's close with our Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And before we go, when I was in college, probably what really got me interested in current Middle Eastern things just on a personal level and give some of this history was a documentary put out by PBS that I think you can go on PBS and watch for free. So if you really are into watching videos and stuff, it's called The Story of the Jews. And if you're just searching online, it's by Simon. I'm not exactly sure how to spell his last name, but it's Shama. Simon Shama. He's a British man. So it gives you a lot of this history from the Old Testament through the Jewish diaspora, Zionism, the return to Israel. Now, recognize this is from a Jewish perspective, so obviously it's going to have a certain interpretation of the history. But anyway, if you'd like a documentary, it's well done. I think 4 or 5 segments, and I found it to just be a good overview of things again, so to kind of reinforce. Okay, thanks also, Margie, for the cookies.
Yeah. Pass those back.